The sound of Catherine O'Brien's fist slamming against Silas Morton's oak desk echoed through the Golden Nugget saloon like a gunshot. $200 for whiskey my father never drank? She demanded, her green eyes blazing with fury. You're lying, Morton, and we both know it. But what Kate didn't know was that in just 3 weeks, a stranger from Boston would walk through those very doors and change everything by burning this place to the ground. September 1876 in Deadwood, Dakota. Territory was a time when gold fever infected every soul who stepped foot in the lawless mining town. The Black Hills promised fortune to thousands of desperate men, but for women like Kate, they offered only servitude and despair. The Golden Nugget Saloon stood at the heart of this chaos, its owner Silas Morton wielding power like a king over subjects who owed him their very lives. Morton leaned back in his leather chair, a cruel smile playing across his weathered face. His grey beard was stained with tobacco juice, and his calculating eyes held the cold indifference of a man who had destroyed countless lives for profit. Your dear departed father, Patrick O'Brien, signed this contract with his own hand, Morton said, sliding a yellowed paper across the desk. Whiskey, gambling debts, room and board. It's all here in black and white, girl. Kate's hands trembled as she examined the document. The signature looked like her father's, but something felt wrong. Patrick O'Brien had been a careful man, suspicious of anyone who offered easy credit. My father was killed in the mine collapse 3 weeks ago, she whispered, her voice cracking. He never had time to drink this much whiskey. Debt don't die with the debtor, Morton replied coldly. According to territorial law, his obligations passed to his next of kin. That'd be you, sweetheart. He stood and walked around the desk, his heavy boots creaking on the wooden floor. Now, you can work off this debt serving drinks and entertaining my customers, or I can have the sheriff escort you to the county jail for theft of services. Your choice? The saloon's main room buzzed with activity beyond the office door. Miners fresh from the claims sat at rough-hewn tables, their faces caked with dirt and their pockets heavy with gold dust. Piano music drifted through the smoky air, mixing with raucous laughter and the constant clink of whiskey glasses. This was Morton's kingdom, and Kate was about to become his newest prisoner. I have no family, no money, Kate said, her voice barely audible. What kind of work are you talking about? She already knew the answer, but part of her hoped Morton might show mercy. Morton's laugh was harsh and humorless. You'll serve drinks, clean tables, keep the customers happy. Some of the girls make good money keeping the lonely miners company. Upstairs. His meaning was clear, and Kate felt her stomach turn. You're a pretty thing, Irish. Red hair, green eyes. The men will pay well for your attention. Kate looked around the office, taking in the expensive furnishings that seemed so out of place in this frontier town. Imported carpets, crystal decanters, leather-bound books, all purchased with money extracted from desperate people like her father. How long? She asked. At current rates, working 6 days a week, maybe 2 years, Morton said casually, as if discussing the weather. Of course, room and board will be deducted from your earnings, plus interest on the original debt. Might take a bit longer. The trap was perfect, and Kate knew it. Work for Morton and slowly sink deeper into debt, or face jail and eventual death in the harsh Dakota wilderness. She thought of her father, who had brought her to Deadwood with dreams of striking it rich. Now she understood why he had always warned her to stay away from the saloons. I'll need time to consider, Kate said, straightening her spine despite the fear coursing through her veins. You've got until tomorrow morning, Morton replied. After that, I'll assume you've chosen jail time. He returned to his desk and began shuffling papers, dismissing her like a servant. Oh, and Kate, don't think about running. This is the only town for 100 miles, and I know every trail out of here. Kate walked through the saloon's main room, feeling the eyes of every man following her movement. Some looked at her with pity, others with the hungry stare of predators who sensed fresh prey. She pushed through the batwing doors into the dusty street, where the afternoon sun beat down mercilessly on the chaotic collection of tents, wooden buildings and muddy walkways that made up Deadwood. The mining camp stretched up the hillsides, like a cancer, growing larger every day as more fortune seekers arrived. Wagons loaded with supplies creaked through the main street, their wheels churning up clouds of dust that mixed with the smoke from countless campfires. The air carried the sounds of hammering, shouting, and the distant rumble of mining equipment working the claims in the surrounding hills. Kate made her way to the small cabin she had shared with her father, now empty except for a few pieces of furniture and the overwhelming silence of grief. She sat on his old wooden chair and stared at the contract Morton had forced her to sign, knowing that tomorrow would bring the beginning of a nightmare she might never escape. What Kate didn't know was that 300 miles away in Cheyenne, a well-dressed man named Jonathan Whitmore was boarding the evening stage to Deadwood, carrying with him the education, connections, and moral conviction that would soon turn Morton's world upside down. The Cheyenne and Black Hills stage rolled into Deadwood 3 days later, its wheels grinding to a halt in front of the Grand Central Hotel as dust swirled around the exhausted horses. Jonathan Whitmore stepped down from the coach, his tailored wool coat and polished leather boots marking him immediately as an outsider in this rough frontier town. He adjusted his wire-rimmed spectacles and surveyed the chaotic scene before him, notebook already in hand. Jonathan had traveled from Boston not for gold, but for truth. As a correspondent for the Massachusetts Herald, he'd been commissioned to document life in America's newest boomtown. His editor wanted stories of adventure and fortune, but Jonathan's trained eye as a former lawyer saw something darker in Deadwood's rapid growth. "First time in Deadwood, mister?" asked the stagecoach driver, a grizzled man named Charlie who'd been making the run for 6 months. "Word of advice, keep your money close and your opinions closer. This ain't Boston." "Indeed it's not," Jonathan replied, tipping the man generously. "Tell me, where would a gentleman find honest lodging and perhaps a decent meal?" Charlie scratched his beard thoughtfully. "Hotels clean enough, food's edible. But if you're looking for entertainment, most folks end up at the Golden Nugget. Just don't expect Sunday school manners." That evening, Jonathan made his way through Deadwood's muddy streets toward the Golden Nugget saloon. Oil lamps flickered in windows of hastily constructed buildings, casting dancing shadows on the wooden sidewalks. The sound of piano music and raucous laughter grew louder as he approached the establishment that seemed to serve as the town's unofficial heart. The saloon's interior was a study in contrasts, expensive fixtures amid rough frontier surroundings. Crystal chandeliers hung from smoke-stained ceiling beams, while spittoons sat beside imported carpets. Jonathan ordered whiskey and positioned himself at a corner table where he could observe the evening's activities. That's when he first saw Catherine O'Brien. She moved between tables with practiced efficiency, carrying a tray of drinks to a group of miners near the bar. Her red hair was pulled back in a simple style, and despite her obvious exhaustion, she maintained a dignified bearing that set her apart from the other working women. Jonathan noticed how she avoided eye contact with the customers, how her jaw tightened when certain men made crude comments, how her hands shook slightly when she thought no one was watching. "Pretty thing, ain't she?" said a voice beside him. Jonathan turned to see a bearded miner settling into the adjacent chair. "Name's Kate O'Brien, Irish girl. Just started working here this week. Word is, her daddy died in the mines and left her with debts to old Morton." Jonathan's attention sharpened. "Debts? $200 for whiskey, they say. Morton's got her bound to this place till it's paid off." The miner lowered his voice. "Course, the way Morton calculates things, she'll be here till she's old and grey. Room, board, interest, it all adds up." Jonathan watched as Kate delivered drinks to another table where a drunk miner grabbed her wrist and pulled her closer. She struggled to free herself while the man's companions laughed. But before she could escape, a large man in an expensive suit approached the table. "Silas Morton," the miner beside Jonathan whispered, "owns this place and half the town besides." Morton was tall and imposing, with the kind of presence that commanded attention through intimidation rather than respect. His grey hair was slicked back with pomade, and his clothes spoke of wealth accumulated through questionable means. "Gentlemen," Morton said to the miners, his voice carrying easily through the noise, "Miss O'Brien is here to serve drinks, not to be handled like merchandise. I trust you understand." The drunk miner released Kate's wrist, but Jonathan could see the calculation in Morton's eyes. This wasn't chivalry. It was a businessman protecting his investment. As the evening progressed, Jonathan observed the subtle dynamics that revealed the Golden Nugget's true nature. Girls who looked barely 18 served men old enough to be their grandfathers. Money changed hands in whispered conversations that had nothing to do with drinks or gambling. Most disturbing was the resigned acceptance in the women's faces, as if they'd abandoned hope of any other life. Near midnight, as the crowd began to thin, Jonathan approached the bar where Kate was cleaning glasses. Up close, he could see the dark circles under her eyes and the way her shoulders sagged with exhaustion. "Excuse me, miss," he said quietly. "Might I have a word?" Kate looked up, startled by his polite tone. Most customers barked orders or made crude propositions. "I'm sorry, sir, but if you're looking for company upstairs, you'll need to speak with Mr. Morton about arrangements." "Nothing like that," Jonathan assured her quickly. "I'm a journalist from Boston, documenting life in Deadwood. I was wondering if you might share your story." Fear flashed across Kate's features. "I can't talk to reporters. Mr. Morton wouldn't like it." She glanced nervously toward the office where Morton conducted his business. "Please, I need this job." Jonathan reached into his coat and withdrew a business card. "Jonathan Whitmore, Massachusetts Herald. If you ever need help, any kind of help, you can find me at the Grand Central Hotel." Kate took the card, her fingers brushing his briefly. For a moment their eyes met, and Jonathan saw something that stirred his conscience more than any story ever could. A desperate hope that someone might actually care about her plight. "Thank you," she whispered, tucking the card into her apron. "In pocket, but there's nothing anyone can do. The debt is legal." Jonathan smiled gently. "Miss O'Brien, I spent 5 years practicing law before becoming a journalist. In my experience, when something feels wrong, it usually is. Legal doesn't always mean just." As Jonathan left the Golden Nugget that night, his mind was already forming. Plans that would challenge everything Silas Morton had built in this lawless town. Jonathan spent the next 5 days quietly gathering information throughout Deadwood, his journalist credentials opening doors that might otherwise remain closed. What he discovered in dusty record books and whispered conversations painted a picture of systematic exploitation that made his blood boil. At the Territorial Recorder's office, a nervous clerk named Henry Watts showed Jonathan the filing records for debt contracts. "See here, Mr. Whitmore," Henry said, pointing to a ledger entry. "Patrick O'Brien's contract was filed the day after he died in the mine collapse. Strange timing, if you ask me." Jonathan examined the document carefully. The ink appeared fresh, and the handwriting showed none of the shakiness typical of a man who'd been drinking heavily. "Have you seen other contracts filed under similar circumstances?" "More than I care to count," Henry admitted, glancing around nervously. "Morton's got a talent for discovering debts right after folks die. Always convenient amounts, just enough to trap their families." That afternoon, Jonathan visited the Silver Star mine, where Patrick O'Brien had worked. The foreman, a weathered Scotsman named Douglas Macready, spat into the dirt when Morton's name was mentioned. Patrick O'Brien was a teetotaler, Macready declared firmly. Lost his wife to drink back in Ireland, swore he'd never touch the stuff, worked every day, sent most of his pay to his daughter for safekeeping. That man never owed Morton a penny. Jonathan's notebook filled with testimonies from miners who'd known Patrick, storekeepers who'd witnessed his careful spending habits, and even the local preacher who confirmed Patrick's sobriety. Every piece of evidence pointed to the same conclusion: the debt was fabricated. On his 6th evening in Deadwood, Jonathan returned to the Golden Nugget with a specific purpose. He waited until Kate finished her shift, then followed her as she walked home through the darkened streets. The small cabin she'd shared with her father sat at the edge of town, isolated and vulnerable. "Miss O'Brien," he called softly, not wanting to startle her. "It's Jonathan Whitmore." Kate turned, her hand instinctively moving to the knife she now carried for protection. "Mr. Whitmore, what are you doing here?" "I've been investigating your father's debt," Jonathan said, stepping into the moonlight so she could see his face clearly. "May I speak with you privately?" Kate hesitated, then unlocked her door and invited him inside. The cabin was sparse but clean, with Patrick's mining clothes still hanging on a peg by the door. She lit an oil lamp, and in its warm glow, Jonathan could see the toll the past week had taken on her. "Kate," he said gently, "your father never owed Morton any money. The debt is a complete fabrication." Kate sank into a chair, her composure finally cracking. "I knew something wasn't right, but I had no way to prove it. Morton has the sheriff in his pocket, and no one else dares cross him." Jonathan pulled out his notebook and showed her the evidence he'd gathered. Witness statements, filing records, testimony from men who worked alongside your father. "We have enough to expose Morton's entire operation." "But what good will it do?" Kate asked, tears streaming down her cheeks. "Even if you prove the debt is false, Morton will find another way to trap me. He owns this town." "Not for much longer," Jonathan said firmly. "I've already sent telegrams to federal authorities in Cheyenne. Fraud is a federal crime, especially when it involves interstate commerce. Morton's been selling these fraudulent contracts to investors in Chicago and New York." Kate looked up at him with a mixture of hope and disbelief. "You'd really do this? Risk making an enemy of the most powerful man in Deadwood for someone you barely know?" Jonathan reached across the small table and took her hand. "Kate, I've seen injustice before, but what Morton is doing to you and other women in this town goes beyond simple greed. It's slavery dressed up in legal contracts. He'll kill you if he finds out," Kate whispered. "Morton doesn't tolerate threats to his business." "Then we'll have to move quickly," Jonathan replied. "I need you to help me get into Morton's office. There are original documents there that will prove the pattern of fraud." Kate pulled her hand away, fear overtaking hope. "I can't. If we're caught, he'll destroy me. There are things worse than serving drinks, Mr. Whitmore." "Much worse." Jonathan stood and moved to the window, looking out at the Golden Nugget in the distance. Its lights blazed against the dark sky like a beacon of corruption in the heart of Deadwood. "Kate, tomorrow night is Saturday. The saloon will be crowded. Morton will be distracted with his gambling operations. That's our chance. And if we fail," Jonathan turned back to her, his expression resolute, "then at least we'll have tried. Your father came to Deadwood dreaming of a better life for you. Don't let Morton steal that dream." Kate was quiet for a long moment, staring at the lamp flame that flickered between them. Finally, she looked up at Jonathan with determination, replacing the fear in her green eyes. "What do you need me to do?" "Keep Morton busy in the main room while I search his office. Can you manage that?" Kate nodded slowly. "He always wants me to serve his private poker games on Saturday nights. The other girls hate those games because the stakes are higher and the men get rougher, but Morton pays extra for my service." Perfect. We'll expose his crimes with his own documents. Jonathan moved toward the door, then paused. Kate, after tomorrow night, your life in Deadwood will change forever. Are you ready for that? Kate stood and walked to her father's mining clothes, running her fingers along the worn fabric. My life here ended the day my father died, Mr. Whitmore. Tomorrow night, maybe I can start living again. As Jonathan walked back to his hotel through Deadwood's muddy streets, he could feel the weight of responsibility settling on his shoulders. Tomorrow would bring either justice or disaster, but there was no turning back now. Saturday night at the Golden Nugget pulsed with dangerous energy. The saloon overflowed with miners celebrating their weekly payday, their pockets heavy with gold dust and their judgment clouded by whiskey. In the back room, Silas Morton hosted his private poker game, where the stakes ran higher than most men earned in a year. Kate moved through the crowd with practiced efficiency, but tonight, every nerve in her body screamed with tension. She caught Jonathan's eye across the room, and he gave her the slightest nod. It was time. Mr. Morton, Kate said, approaching the poker table with a tray of fresh whiskey. You gentlemen look like you could use some refreshments. Morton barely glanced up from his cards, his attention focused on the pile of gold coins at the center of the table. About time, girl. These gentlemen have been waiting. He gestured dismissively toward the other players, wealthy mine owners, and merchants who came to Morton's private games, seeking both profit and influence. As Kate served the drinks, she deliberately knocked over a glass, sending whiskey splashing across the table and into the lap of James Crawford, the richest mine owner in the Black Hills. "Oh no, I'm so sorry, Mr. Crawford," Kate exclaimed, grabbing a cloth and making a show of cleaning up the mess. The distraction worked perfectly. While Morton and his guests focused on the spilled whiskey and Crawford's stained trousers, Jonathan slipped unnoticed into Morton's office. The office was dimly lit by a single oil lamp, casting shadows across the expensive furnishings. Jonathan moved quickly to Morton's desk, where a locked strongbox sat beside stacks of contracts and correspondence. Using skills learned during his law school days, Jonathan picked the simple lock and opened the box. Inside, he found exactly what he'd hoped for. Original contracts with obvious alterations, correspondence with investors describing the profitable debt acquisition business, and most damning of all, a ledger detailing how Morton created false debts by forging signatures of deceased miners. Jonathan carefully photographed each document with his portable camera, a new invention he'd brought from Boston. The flash powder illuminated the office briefly, but the sound was masked by the noise from the main room. Just as Jonathan finished returning the documents to their original positions, he heard Morton's voice growing louder in the corridor. "Kate, where did that clumsy Irish girl disappear to?" Jonathan slipped out the office's back door just as Morton entered from the front. Through the window, he watched Morton check his strongbox, unaware that the evidence of his crimes had just been documented. 20 minutes later, as Jonathan sat at his corner table reviewing the photographs, 3 men in federal uniforms entered the Golden Nugget. Deputy Marshal William Hayes had received Jonathan's telegraph and ridden hard from Cheyenne with his best men. "Silas Morton," Hayes announced, his voice cutting through the saloon's noise like a blade. "You're under arrest for mail fraud, conspiracy, and violation of federal interstate commerce laws." The saloon fell silent, except for the ticking of the grandfather clock near the bar. Morton emerged from his private game, his face flushed with anger and disbelief. "This is preposterous. I'm a legitimate businessman." Jonathan stood and handed Marshal Hayes the photographs. "These documents prove systematic fraud involving investors in Chicago and New York. Mr. Morton has been creating false debts against deceased miners and selling those contracts to out-of-state investors." Morton's eyes found Jonathan across the room, and his expression turned murderous. "You meddling Eastern fool, you have no idea what you've done." "I know exactly what I've done," Jonathan replied calmly. "I've exposed a criminal who preys on grieving families." As the marshals led Morton away in shackles, Hayes turned to address the crowd. "Any contracts or debts held by Silas Morton are hereby considered void pending federal investigation. Women held here against their will are free to leave immediately." Kate felt her knees buckle as the weight of 2 weeks' terror finally lifted from her shoulders. Jonathan appeared beside her, steadying her with a gentle hand on her arm. 3 days later, Jonathan and Kate stood watching as federal agents supervised the controlled burning of the Golden Nugget. The building that had symbolized Morton's power over Deadwood's vulnerable citizens went up in flames, its smoke carrying away the last vestiges of corruption that had plagued the town. "What will you do now?" Jonathan asked Kate as they watched the fire consume the crystal chandeliers that had been purchased with blood money. Kate smiled for the first time since her father's death. "I'm going to start a dressmaking business. Deadwood has plenty of families now, and they need proper clothing. What about you?" "I think Deadwood needs a lawyer more than it needs a journalist," Jonathan replied. "Someone to make sure what happened to you never happens to anyone else." Kate turned to face him, her green eyes bright with hope instead of fear. "I'd like that very much, Jonathan. Deadwood deserves a chance to become the honest town my father dreamed it could be." As the last beam fell from the Golden Nugget's frame, the flames reached toward the Dakota sky, transforming corruption into cleansing fire and despair into hope. Sometimes justice arrives not with the thunder of cavalry charges, but with the quiet determination of good people who refuse to accept that wrong must triumph over right. In Deadwood's dusty streets, courage conquered greed, and love burned brighter than any saloon's flames. If this story of hope, triumphing over despair, touched your heart, please subscribe and hit that notification bell to join our community of storytelling enthusiasts. Share your thoughts in the comments below. Have you ever witnessed someone stand up against impossible odds? Your stories inspire our next adventures, and together we'll continue exploring the remarkable moments when ordinary people choose to do extraordinary things. Until our next journey into the past, remember that every act of courage, no matter how small, has the power to change someone's world forever.